The dust on Main Street hadn't even thought about settling when Jack Morrison swung himself off his horse. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Millbrook, the kind of scorching day that makes the air itself feel angry. 23 years. 23 years since he'd last kicked up the dirt in this god-forsaken town, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to see. There, tucked under the faded green awning of Henderson's general store, sat a woman whose face had been the star of his nightmares and his daydreams for over 2 decades. But this wasn't the girl he remembered, the one with laughter in her eyes and a fire in her soul. This was someone else, someone broken, someone desperate. And in her hands she held a weathered piece of cardboard, a sign with just a few simple words that were about to detonate the entire life he thought he'd built. What Jack Morrison did next would become the single most talked about event in Millbrook's 150-year history. It sparked arguments in saloons, whispers in church pews, and debates on front porches that would echo down through generations. Some would call him a fool, others an angel sent straight from heaven itself. But every single person agreed on one thing. Nobody saw it coming. Jack Morrison had clawed his way to the top. He'd built an empire one dusty cattle drive at a time, one ruthless business deal after another. The leather of his boots was a roadmap of 1,000 hard miles, and the calluses on his hands told stories of work that would break most men in half. At 41, he owned the biggest ranching operation in 3 counties. He had over 200 men on his payroll and enough cash in the bank to buy a small country if the mood struck him. But all that success had a price, and that price was a deep, gnawing emptiness that got a little bigger with each passing year. The whole thing started with a telegram. It arrived on a Monday morning, slapped onto his desk while Jack was staring at quarterly reports in his oak-paneled office. His foreman, a grizzled old-timer named Pete Donovan, had knocked twice before cracking the door open, holding the little yellow paper like it was a death notice, which in a way it was. "Boss, this came for you on the morning wire," Pete had mumbled, his voice gravelly. Jack had taken it without even looking up, expecting news about cattle prices or shipping delays. But the words he saw weren't about business. They were a ghost from a past he'd spent half his life trying to bury. "Your father passed. Funeral Thursday. Come home. Sheriff Wallace." The paper trembled in his hand. Not from grief. His relationship with his father had been complicated, to put it mildly. It was the simple, brutal fact of having to go back. Going back to Millbrook meant facing ghosts he'd buried so deep, he'd almost convinced himself they were gone for good. Thomas Morrison had been a hard man, a man who believed love was a weakness and feelings were for fools. He'd raised Jack with an iron fist and a colder heart, teaching him one lesson above all others. In this world, you look out for number one. You trust no one. The day Jack turned 18, he'd announced he was leaving. His father had stood in the doorway of their little ranch house, his body blocking out the sun. "You walk out that door now, boy," he'd said, his voice flat and dead, "and you're dead to me. Don't you come crawling back when the world chews you up and spits you out." Jack had left anyway. He had $17 in his pocket, the clothes on his back, and a heart that felt like it was being ripped in two. Not because of his father's words, but because leaving meant leaving her. Now, 23 years later, he was riding back into town. Not as the heartbroken kid who'd fled in the night, but as a king who had conquered everything life threw at him. Everything except one. He had never, for a single day, learned how to stop loving Catherine Wells. The train ride from Dallas had given him 36 hours to steel himself. But as the familiar, dusty hills rolled past his window, Jack knew no amount of time could have prepared him for the flood of memories. The creek where they'd stolen their first kiss, the summer air so thick with fireflies it looked like the stars had fallen to earth. The old oak tree where they'd carved their initials, swearing they'd love each other until the end of time. Catherine Wells had been the one beautiful thing in a world that seemed hell-bent on being ugly. She was the banker's daughter, raised in the biggest house in town, destined for a life of fancy parties and silk dresses. A life a poor rancher's son like him could only dream of providing. But none of that mattered when they were 17. They had a plan, a secret plan. Jack would go work the cattle drives. save every penny he made, and come back for her. He'd come back a man who could give her the world. And Catherine had promised to wait. She had sworn it. They'd made those promises under a sky full of stars, young and dumb enough to believe love could actually conquer all. Life, it turned out, had other plans. The funeral was a quiet affair. Thomas Morrison had been respected, but he hadn't been loved. Jack stood by the grave, scanning the handful of faces, feeling like a stranger in his own hometown. After the service, Sheriff Wallace, now gray and bent with age, shuffled over to him. "Jack, it's good to see you, son. Sorry about your father." "Thanks for sending the wire, Sheriff." Wallace shuffled his feet, his weathered face creased with worry. "There's something else, Jack. It's about the old homestead. Your father, well, he was struggling. There are debts, boy. More than the land is worth." Jack wasn't surprised. His father's pride had always been bigger than his business sense. "How much?" "Near $8,000. $8,000. In Millbrook, that was a fortune. To Jack, it was less than he spent on cattle feed in a month. He could have written a check right there, saved the family land without even blinking. But something stopped him. He needed to understand. He needed to know what had really happened in the 23 years he'd been gone. "I'll take care of it," he told the sheriff, "but I need a few days." Those few days turned into a week. Jack stayed at the Millbrook Inn, a little place run by a widow named Mrs. Hendricks, who remembered him as the wild kid who used to steal apples from her orchard. She fussed over him like a mother, and Jack found himself lingering over breakfast, listening to her gentle chatter about town gossip. It was during one of those breakfasts that her name came up, Catherine's name. "Such a terrible shame about the Wells family," Mrs. Hendricks said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she refilled his coffee. "Poor Catherine's had it so hard." Jack's hand froze. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Mrs. Hendricks's eyes lit up, sensing a good story. "Oh, that's right. You two were sweet on each other, weren't you? Well, she married Robert Ashford about 6 months after you left town. Big wedding. The whole town was there. Her father spared no expense." The coffee turned to acid in Jack's mouth. Robert Ashford. He remembered him, the son of the town's richest merchant, college-educated, smooth-talking, and born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Everything Jack wasn't. "They seemed happy at first," Mrs. Hendricks went on, completely oblivious to the hurricane she was unleashing inside Jack's chest. "Had two beautiful children, a boy and a girl. Robert took over his father's business. Did well for a while. They were the toast of the town, living in that big house on Elm Street." Jack just waited. He could hear the but coming. "But then Robert, he started drinking. Not the social kind, mind you. The mean kind. The kind that changes a man. The business started to fail, and there were rumors." She leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. "Rumors he'd started gambling. High-stakes poker in the back room of Murphy's saloon." The story got darker with every word. Robert's drinking turned violent. The family fortune vanished into a black hole of bad bets and bad decisions. Catherine tried to hold it all together. She took in sewing, did laundry for other families, anything to make ends meet. It wasn't enough. "The final blow came 3 years ago," Mrs. Hendricks said, her voice heavy with pity. "Robert was found dead, behind Murphy's saloon. Some said it was his heart, from all the drinking, but others whispered he'd gotten mixed up with some very dangerous men from Dallas. Men who don't take kindly to unpaid debts." Jack set his coffee cup down. His hand was shaking. "And Catherine, she lost everything. The house, the business, all of it went to pay Robert's debts. She and the children had to move. They live in that old boarding house on Creek Road now, the one where the railroad workers used to stay." The boarding house on Creek Road. Jack knew it. A ramshackle pile of rotting wood that was considered a slum even when he was a kid. The thought of Catherine, the girl of silk dresses and garden parties, living in a place like that, it made his chest tighten with a rage so fierce it almost choked him. "What about her father?" Jack managed to ask. "The banker? Surely he could help." Mrs. Hendricks shook her head sadly. "Marcus Wells died 2 years before Robert. lost most of his own money in some bad investments. There was nothing left for Catherine to inherit, nothing but heartache. After that conversation, Jack couldn't focus. He walked the streets of Millbrook in a daze, the ghost of Catherine Wells everywhere he looked. He saw her in the flash of auburn hair disappearing around a corner, heard her laugh in the chatter drifting from a shop. But she was never there, until that scorching Tuesday afternoon. He'd just left the bank, having finalized the papers to settle his father's estate. He stepped out onto Main Street, the sun beating down so hard the air shimmered. And that's when he saw her. At first he wasn't sure. The woman sitting on a wooden crate in the shade looked nothing like the vibrant girl he remembered. Her clothes were faded and patched. Her hair, once a fiery cascade of auburn, hung limp and dull. But then she looked up, and he saw her eyes. Those same green eyes that had owned his soul for 23 years. Now they were just empty, dulled by hardship and a desperation so deep it was terrifying. And in her lap she held a piece of cardboard. In careful printed letters it read, "Please help. 2 children to feed. God bless." The world stopped. It just stopped. The sounds of the town, the nicker of a horse, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, faded into a dull roar in his ears. This was Catherine, his Catherine, begging for pennies on a dusty street corner. He saw Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, hurry past, her face turned away as if Catherine were invisible. A moment later, a young boy tossed a single penny into the little tin can at her feet, not even breaking stride. Jack's hands clenched into fists. The Catherine he knew would have died before she endured this. She would have starved before she let anyone see her this diminished. The fact that she was still sitting there told him things were even worse than Mrs. Hendricks had described. He started walking toward her. With every step, the details got sharper, more painful. The dress, once blue, now faded to the color of dust. The calluses on her hands. The deep, weary lines etched around her eyes. She looked up when he was still 20 feet away, maybe sensing his stare. Their eyes locked across the dusty street, and for one single impossible second, the 23 years vanished. They were 17 again, full of secrets and dreams under a blanket of Texas stars. The moment shattered. Recognition flooded her face, then disbelief. Then a wave of shame so powerful it was like a physical blow. She dropped her gaze to the ground, trying to shrink, to disappear into herself. Jack didn't stop. He walked right up to her, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. The tremor in her hands. 1,000 speeches, 100 apologies, all the words he'd rehearsed in his head for years. They all evaporated into the dry, hot air. Only one thing was left. The simple, raw truth. He knelt down in the dirt in front of her. "Hello, Catherine." She looked up again, her green eyes swimming. When she spoke, her voice was a ghost, a roughened, exhausted whisper of the girl she used to be. "Jack Morrison," she breathed, his name barely audible. I didn't know you were back." The silence that hung between them was a canyon carved by 23 years of unspoken words. Jack stayed kneeling, ignoring the small crowd of townsfolk that had started to gather, their faces hungry for the drama unfolding on Main Street. "You look," Catherine started, then stopped. How could she say it? That he looked good, that success suited him, when the contrast between them was so brutally obvious. "Different," Jack finished for her, his voice gentle. "We both do." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "That's one way to put it." She gestured at her faded dress, the cardboard sign, the pitiful collection of coins in the tin can. "I suppose this isn't how you imagined you'd find me." "I never stopped imagining finding you," Jack said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "But you're right, not like this." The admission hung there, raw and honest. Catherine felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. A ghost of the girl who used to believe in happy endings. But reality came crashing back, cold and hard. The children waiting for her, the landlord expecting his rent, the grocer who wouldn't give her any more credit. "I should go," she said, trying to stand. "Emma and Samuel will be wondering where I am." "Your children." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Emma's 13. Samuel is 11. They're, they're good children. Better than they deserve. Jack stood up, his mind racing. Have you eaten today? The question was so direct it sliced right through her defenses. She opened her mouth to lie, to cling to the last shred of her pride, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was carved into the hollows of her cheeks. Come with me, Jack said, a decision that felt as natural as breathing. Let's get some food. I can't, she protested, even as her own stomach betrayed her with a low growl. People will talk. I, I can't be seen with you. Not like this. Jack glanced at the gawking crowd. He recognized faces from his youth, all of them watching, waiting. He saw Mrs. Clara Whitman, the town's primary gossip, her eyes shining with anticipation. By nightfall, this story would be in every home in Millbrook. Propriety, Jack said, his voice low but firm, loud enough for the onlookers to hear, is a luxury you can't afford right now. And frankly, I don't give a damn what these people think. The words hit the crowd like a shockwave. This wasn't the boy who'd slunk out of town 23 years ago. This was a man who commanded respect. Catherine felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from relief. For so long, she had carried everything alone. This small offer of help felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The children, she whispered, her last defense crumbling. Bring them, Jack said. All of you. Now. The boarding house on Creek Road was even worse than Jack had imagined. The whole building sagged, paint peeling off the walls like sunburnt skin. The air inside smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. Catherine led him down a narrow, dark hallway to a single room at the very end. It was barely big enough for the 3 narrow beds that took up most of the space, and there were the children. Emma, at 13, had her mother's auburn hair and green eyes, but hers still had a spark of defiance that hardship hadn't quite managed to snuff out. She was bent over a makeshift desk, painstakingly copying letters from a worn-out book. Samuel, 11 and all bony knees and elbows, sat on a bed, carefully mending a tear in what looked like his only shirt. They both looked up when their mother entered, their faces instantly clouding with worry. They had learned to read her moods, to know in an instant if the day had been a success or a failure. The sight of a stranger with her clearly terrified them. Emma, Samuel, Catherine said, her voice tight. This is Mr. Morrison, an old friend of mine. Jack stepped forward, taking off his hat. Pleased to meet you both. Your mother and I knew each other when we were about your age. Emma managed a small, shaky curtsy. Samuel scrambled to his feet and tried to bow. They had been taught manners from a world they no longer belonged to. Mr. Morrison has invited us to have dinner, Catherine said, watching their faces. At the hotel. The change was instant and heartbreaking. Emma's eyes went wide with a wonder she probably hadn't felt in years. Samuel just stared, as if he couldn't possibly have heard right. A meal at the Millbrook Inn was a luxury so far beyond their reality, it was like being invited to the moon. All of us? Emma whispered. All of us, Jack confirmed. 20 minutes later, the 4 of them walked down Main Street. The dining room of the Millbrook Inn went silent as they entered. Every eye turned to watch them. Mrs. Hendricks, the owner, nearly dropped a plate of food. Table for 4, Mrs. Hendricks, Jack said calmly, as if he did this every day. She recovered quickly, her natural kindness winning out over her shock. Of course, Mr. Morrison. Right this way. She led them to the best table in the house, right by the window. The meal was a blur. For the other diners, it was a scandal to be picked apart for weeks. For Emma and Samuel, it was a miracle. But for Jack and Catherine, it was a chance to build a fragile bridge across the canyon of 23 years. They talked carefully, avoiding the painful details. Jack spoke of his early, back-breaking years as a ranch hand. Catherine shared stories of her early married life, carefully editing out the darkness. The children, at first shy and overwhelmed, slowly began to relax. Emma revealed a sharp, intelligent mind that reminded Jack so much of her mother. Samuel, full of questions about ranch life, peppered Jack with an enthusiasm that made his eyes shine. It was during dessert, apple pie that made Samuel's eyes roll back in his head with bliss, that the evening took a turn. Emma, emboldened by the warm food and strange kindness, looked Jack right in the eye. Mr. Morrison, she asked, her voice polite but firm. Are you very rich? Emma! Catherine gasped, mortified. Jack held up a hand. It's a fair question, he said, meeting Emma's gaze. Yes, I suppose I am. Emma considered this with the gravity of a judge. Then why are you being so kind to us? People usually aren't. The honesty of it hit Jack like a punch to the gut. A 13-year-old girl who had already learned that kindness was rare, that people in their position were more likely to be met with contempt than compassion. Sometimes, Jack said carefully, people are kind because they remember what it was like to need kindness themselves. And sometimes they're kind because they care about someone, and that caring extends to the people that person loves. Emma seemed to accept this, but Samuel, never one for subtlety, fixed Jack with a stare that was all business. Are you going to marry our mother? The question dropped into the silent dining room like a bomb. Catherine went pale. Every single person in the room was now staring openly at their table. Samuel, you can't just, Catherine stammered, but Jack was strangely moved. This wasn't a childish question. This was the question of a boy who had been forced to be a man too soon, who desperately wanted someone to help carry the burden that was crushing his mother. Jack looked from the boy's hopeful face to Catherine's terrified one. That's not really my decision to make, he said gently, his eyes on Catherine. That would be up to your mother. But I can tell you this. I think you are both remarkable young people, and any man would be lucky to have you as part of his family. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and it was enough. Walking them back to the boarding house felt like returning them to a cage. At the door to their cramped, miserable room, Catherine turned to him. Thank you, Jack, she whispered, for the meal, for your kindness, for everything. Don't thank me yet, Jack said, the words a quiet promise. This is just the beginning. As he walked back to the inn, his mind was already spinning. A plan was forming, a plan that was bold, dangerous, and would change not just their lives but the entire town of Millbrook. A plan that would either save them all or destroy any chance he had with her for good. Dawn in Millbrook was still a gray promise on the horizon, but Jack Morrison was already wide awake. He stood at the window of his room at the inn, a cold cup of coffee forgotten in his hand, watching the town sleep while his mind burned with a plan. A plan that was either the most compassionate thing he'd ever do or the most foolish. By the time the sun was up, he'd made his choice. His first stop was the First National Bank. Harold Petton, the bank president, was a twitchy, nervous man who looked like he'd been born in a suit that was 2 sizes too small. He jumped to his feet when Jack walked into his office. Mr. Morrison, I wasn't expecting you. Is everything with your father's estate in order? It is, Jack said, sitting down without being invited. I'm here about another matter. The Ashford debt. Petton's face went through a whole range of emotions. Surprise, confusion, then the careful, blank expression of a man walking on eggshells. The Ashford debt? I'm afraid that matter was settled years ago. We recovered what we could from Robert's estate. The rest was written off. What about Catherine Ashford? Jack pressed. Was she held responsible? Well, no, not legally, Petton stammered, adjusting his spectacles. The debts were in Robert's name, but... He hesitated. But what? There were certain informal arrangements, Petton admitted, his voice dropping. You see, Robert had borrowed from a lot of important people. When he died, they felt misled. There was a general understanding that Mrs. Ashford would be encouraged to make restitution, to show good faith. The ugly truth began to form in Jack's mind. They were bleeding her dry. Creditors with no legal claim were using social pressure and threats to squeeze every last penny out of a destitute widow. It wasn't just business, it was cruelty. How much? Jack asked, his voice cold as ice. Petton fumbled with a ledger. Approximately $3,000. Jack pulled a bank draft from his coat pocket and slapped it on the desk. I'll cover all of it. I want receipts showing Catherine Ashford's obligations have been satisfied in full. And I want letters sent to every one of those important people, making it clear that if they ever try to collect another cent from her or her children, they'll be dealing with my lawyers. Petton stared at the bank draft, then at Jack, his mouth hanging open. But why? What is Mrs. Ashford to you? Jack met his gaze. She's someone who deserves better, he said, and walked out the door. His next stop was Henderson's General Store. Oliver Henderson was a good man who had let Catherine run up a small account for basic food, but even his patience was wearing thin. Oliver, Jack said, laying two $20 gold pieces on the counter. I want to settle Catherine Ashford's account. Henderson's eyes widened. Jack, that's mighty generous, but she's a proud woman. She might not take kindly to charity. Then don't call it charity, Jack said. Tell her an old family debt of her father's was just repaid to the store. Tell her anything. Just make sure she and her children don't go hungry again. By noon, Jack had visited every merchant in town who had a claim, real or imagined, against Catherine Ashford. He moved like a quiet storm, leaving a trail of settled debts and stunned shopkeepers in his wake. By the time the gossip mill started churning, Catherine Ashford had gone from the most indebted woman in Millbrook to completely debt-free. But Jack was just getting started. His next visit was to Preston Matthews, the town's best lawyer. Preston, Jack said, getting straight to the point, I want to buy property. Matthews leaned back, his interest piqued. What did you have in mind? The old Jameson place has some prime grazing land. I want the house on Elm Street, Jack said. The old Ashford place. Matthews' eyebrows shot up. The Ashford mansion, the grandest house in town, had been sitting empty and rotting for 3 years since the bank foreclosed on it. Jack, that place needs a mountain of work. The roof leaks, the grounds are a mess. I'll pay $2,000, cash, Jack said, cutting him off, and I want the deed made out in one name. And whose name would that be? Matthews asked, readying his pen. Catherine Ashford. The lawyer just stared at him, speechless. Jack, are you insane? You're going to buy the house she lost and just give it back to her? It should never have been taken from her in the first place, Jack said, his voice hard. Her husband's debts were not her debts. Watching her children grow up in that hellhole on Creek Road while their rightful home sits empty is an injustice. I'm just correcting it. Matthews shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. Jack, have you thought about how she's going to react to this? Pride like hers, a gift this big might feel more like a burden. It was the one question that had kept Jack up all night. Then I'll just have to convince her, he said, that accepting help isn't the same as accepting charity. As the sun began to set, Jack found himself back on Creek Road, standing outside the sagging, miserable boarding house. In his hand, he held a leather portfolio. Inside were the documents that would either change Catherine's life forever or drive a permanent wedge between them. He could hear her soft voice through the thin door, reading a story to the children, a little pocket of peace in a world of despair. He took a deep breath. Everything he had built, everything he had become, it had all led to this moment. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed down the dark hallway like a judgment. The knock on the door made Catherine's heart jump. Visitors were rare, and they usually meant trouble. She opened it a crack and saw Jack Morrison standing there, the setting sun at his back, a leather portfolio in his hand. He looked like a figure from another world. Jack, she breathed, acutely aware of the shabby room behind her, of her patched dress, of everything she was and everything he was. What are you doing here? I need to speak with you, he said, his voice serious. All of you. She let him in. The room seemed to shrink with him in it. He sat in the single rickety chair while Catherine and the children perched on the beds. He started by telling the children a story about a real-life Robinson Crusoe, his voice calm and steady, putting them at ease. Catherine watched, her anxiety growing with every passing second. This wasn't a social call. Finally, he opened the portfolio. Catherine, he began, his tone formal, I need you to hear me out completely before you respond. A chill went down her spine. This morning, he said, looking her straight in the eye, I paid off every debt your late husband left behind. Every single one. You owe nothing to anyone in this town. She just stared, her mind unable to process the words. She opened her mouth to protest, to ask the 1,000 questions that were screaming in her head, but he held up a hand. Before you say anything, there's more. He pulled out another document, this one with the official seal of the county courthouse. I've also purchased your family's home on Elm Street. The deed is being transferred to your name. Tomorrow morning, you and the children can move back home." The silence in the tiny room was absolute. It was so quiet Jack could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. Emma was the first to speak. "Our old house?" she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The big one with the garden?" "Yes," Jack said gently. "The house where you were born." Catherine finally found her voice. It was barely a whisper, but it landed in the room with the force of a hammer blow. "No!" The single word hung in the air, flat and final. Jack's carefully laid plans shattered into a million pieces. "Mama," Emma said, confused, "don't you want to go home?" "This is our home," Catherine said, her voice gaining strength, her eyes flashing with a fire Jack hadn't seen in 23 years. "This is what we have earned. We don't accept charity." "It's not charity, Catherine." Jack stood up, his own frustration rising. "It's justice." "Is it?" She stood to face him, her body rigid with anger. "You disappear for 23 years without a single word. You come back, find me at my lowest point, and now you want to swoop in and play the hero? To ease your own guilt by throwing money at my problems? How am I supposed to accept that, Jack? How does that not feel like charity?" The accusation hit its mark. He had been gone. He hadn't been there. His sudden reappearance as her savior was, in a way, driven by his own guilt. "What happens," she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion, "when the whole town starts whispering? When they decide that the poor widow Ashford sold herself to the rich rancher to get her house back? What do I tell my children when they hear those whispers?" The argument raged, a storm of 23 years of pain and pride and regret. Jack argued with logic, talking about the children's future, their safety, their education. Catherine countered with fierce independence, with dignity, with the scars of a woman who had learned to survive on her own terms. They were at a stalemate, two immovable forces. Then a small voice cut through the anger. It was Emma. "Mama," she asked, tears in her eyes, "why can't we just say thank you?" The simple, honest question from her daughter stopped Catherine cold. She looked at her children, at Emma's pleading face, at Samuel's wide, hopeful eyes, and she saw it. She saw that her pride, the only thing she had left, might be the very thing that was costing her children their future. The fight went out of her. She sank back onto the bed, defeated. "I need time to think," she whispered. Jack nodded, knowing he could push no further. He stopped at the door. "Whatever you decide, Catherine," he said, his voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't name. "Know that my offer comes with no expectations, nothing more than seeing you and your children safe and happy." He left. The portfolio of documents sat on the small table, a silent testament to a future that was suddenly, terrifyingly within her reach. Outside, Jack walked back to the inn, feeling like he'd lost the most important battle of his life. He had tried to give her a kingdom, but he was beginning to realize that some gifts are too heavy to accept. The town of Millbrook held its breath for 3 days. The story of Jack Morrison's offer had spread like wildfire, and everyone was waiting to see what the widow Ashford would do. Catherine kept to herself, a prisoner in her small room, wrestling with a decision that felt impossible. The choice was made for her on a Thursday afternoon. It happened in the alley behind the boarding house. Samuel, being an 11-year-old boy, was climbing a rotten fence. A board snapped. He fell, tumbling into a pile of junk. Broken glass, rusted metal, that the landlord had been too lazy to clear away. The scream brought Catherine running. The gash on his palm was deep, bleeding with a terrifying speed that her makeshift bandages couldn't stop. She scooped him up and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ran all the way to the other side of town, to the clean, respectable street where Dr. Holloway lived. By the time she reached his door, her dress was soaked in her son's blood, and Samuel had gone limp and pale in her arms. The housekeeper, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, blocked the doorway. "The doctor is busy," she said, her eyes flicking over Catherine's blood-stained dress with disdain. "And he requires payment in advance. $50 for an emergency." $50. It might as well have been $1 million. Catherine had 3. Please, she begged, her voice cracking. Look at him. He's losing too much blood. I'll find a way to pay, I promise. I'm sorry, the housekeeper said, already closing the door. No payment, no treatment. Desperation is a powerful thing. Catherine shoved past the woman and burst into the house. Dr. Holloway, she screamed. My son needs help. The doctor, a distinguished-looking man, emerged from his office. He took one look at Samuel, and his professional instincts took over. He rushed them into his treatment room and went to work, his skilled hands moving quickly to stop the bleeding, to clean and stitch the deep wounds. It was only after the crisis had passed, after Samuel was breathing steadily, that the doctor turned to her, washing his hands in a basin of water now pink with blood. The surgery was more complex than I anticipated, he said, his voice cold and clinical. The total will be $75. Catherine just stared at him, the new impossible number sucking the air from her lungs. Her silence was all the answer he needed. I see, he said. And then he said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In that case, I'll have to hold the boy until the debt is satisfied. Standard practice. He'll remain here as my ward. A boy his age can be useful. It should only take a year, perhaps 2 of his labor, to cover the cost. The room began to spin. He was going to keep her son, keep Samuel as an indentured servant, a slave, to pay for the medical care that had just saved his life. She would have to leave him here. Just then a voice cut through her terror, a voice like iron. The hell he will. Jack Morrison stood in the doorway. He must have heard about the accident. His eyes took in the scene. Samuel pale on the table. Catherine's tear-streaked face, the doctor's smug expression, and his face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He didn't say another word. He just walked to the table, pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet, and laid it down next to the bloody instruments. Keep the change, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He looked at Dr. Holloway. And if I ever hear of you threatening to hold a child hostage for payment again, you'll find yourself explaining your business practices to a very unfriendly judge in a Dallas courtroom. Do you understand me? The doctor, his face flushed with anger and fear, just nodded and pocketed the money. He's strong enough to be moved now, Jack said. He gently lifted the still unconscious Samuel into his arms. He looked at Catherine. Can you walk? She could only nod, her legs threatening to buckle. The walk back to the boarding house was a blur. The whole town seemed to be watching as the rich rancher carried the widow's injured son through the dusty streets. Back in their small room, Jack laid Samuel carefully on his bed. Emma, who had been brought from the inn, rushed to her brother's side, crying silently. Jack sat in the single chair, his face grim. He's going to be fine, he said quietly. Then he looked at Catherine. I know you haven't made your decision, he said, his voice gentle but firm. And I don't want to pressure you, but today showed me something. It showed me that your pride, as admirable as it is a luxury you can no longer afford. Not when it puts your children's lives at risk. The words stung because they were the absolute, undeniable truth. Her pride had almost cost her everything. She looked at her son, breathing peacefully. She looked at her daughter, her face etched with a worry no 13-year-old should ever know. And she looked at Jack, the man who had, for the second time in a week, appeared like an angel of mercy when all hope was lost. The last of her resistance crumbled. Her pride was a fortress, but the love for her children was a tidal wave that just washed it all away. All right, Jack, she whispered, the words tasting of surrender and relief. We'll accept your help. She took a shaky breath, clinging to one last piece of control. But on one condition, I want a formal contract, a loan, with repayment terms and interest. I will pay you back, every single cent. Jack smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face since he'd returned. Whatever terms you want, Catherine, he said. We'll have the lawyer draw up the papers tomorrow. He stood to leave. At the door he paused. You don't need to thank me, he said softly. You would have done the same for me. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Catherine Ashford fell asleep without wondering where her children's next meal would come from, or if they'd have a roof over their heads in the morning. The real story was just beginning. The move from Creek Road to Elm Street was like traveling between two different countries. One was a land of shadows and decay, the other a world of sunshine and possibility. As Jack's hired men loaded their few, pitiful belongings into a large wagon, Catherine stood in the doorway of the boarding house room, a place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, and felt a dizzying mix of hope and terror. The house on Elm Street was more beautiful than she remembered. Jack hadn't just bought it, he had restored it. The peeling paint was gone, replaced by a fresh, clean white. The broken shutters were fixed. And the garden took her breath away. It was exactly as she'd left it. Her roses climbed the trellises, the herb garden was neat and full, the old apple tree had been pruned back to health. "You remembered," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "I remembered everything," Jack said quietly from beside her. Inside, the house was a wonderland. Jack had furnished it, not with lavish, ostentatious pieces, but with simple, solid, comfortable furniture. The kitchen had a new stove, the plumbing worked, and the library. Emma's gasp of pure joy echoed through the house when she saw it. The shelves were filled with hundreds of brand new books. Samuel just ran through the spacious rooms, laughing, simply celebrating the fact that he could run without hitting a wall. It was all perfect, a fairy tale. But as Catherine stood in the master bedroom, the room she had shared with Robert, a room haunted by the ghosts of angry words and the smell of whiskey, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. This wasn't her life. She was an imposter, playing a role in a story written by someone else. She was the same woman who, just a week ago, was begging for pennies. Poverty had carved itself into her soul, and a new house couldn't just erase the scars. That evening, after the children were asleep in their own spacious rooms for the first time in years, she and Jack sat in the parlor. "Do you expect this to lead to something more?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Between us, because I need to know." Jack looked at her, his expression serious. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't hope for it," he admitted. "I've never stopped loving you, Catherine. But I also know we're not the same people we were at 17. Whatever happens between us has to be built on who we are now." "I need time, Jack," she said. "Time to figure out who I am in this new life." "You have all the time in the world," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." 2 months passed. Millbrook settled into a new reality. The gossip slowly faded as people saw Catherine carrying herself with quiet dignity, her children thriving. A fragile peace settled over the house on Elm Street. And then Victoria Peaton arrived from Dallas. She was the bank president's niece, and she was everything Catherine wasn't. She was sophisticated, sharply dressed, and moved with the easy confidence of a woman who had never known a day of hardship in her life. She was beautiful, intelligent, and she made it very clear from the moment she arrived that she had come to Millbrook for one reason: Jack Morrison. She cornered him at church, at the general store, inserting herself into his life with surgical precision. She spoke his language, the language of business, of investments, of cattle markets. She made Catherine, with her focus on her children and her garden, feel small and provincial. The tension came to a head at one of Jack's weekly dinners with the family. It was Samuel who, with the brutal honesty of a child, dropped the bomb. "Mr. Morrison," he asked in the middle of dinner, "are you going to marry that lady from Dallas?" The silence was deafening. Jack tried to deflect, but Emma chimed in. "You like her, I can tell. You smile different when you talk about her." Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine confronted him. "Maybe it's time we acknowledge reality, Jack," she said, her heart breaking with every word. "She's a better match for you. Kindness shouldn't trap you in a life you don't want." "Trap me?" Jack's voice was full of disbelief. "Catherine, these evenings with you and your children, this is the closest to real happiness I've ever known." "But it's not enough, is it?" she pressed, the insecurity in the town's whispers finally boiling over. "We're just playing house. I'm your charity case. She's your equal." "Is that what you think this is?" he asked, his frustration finally showing. "Charity? Isn't it?" she shot back. "Be honest. If you'd found me prosperous and happy, would you have been so careful, so patient, or would you have fought for me?" The question hit him like a physical blow, because it was true. He had been treating her like something fragile, something to be saved. He'd been so afraid of pressuring her, so caught up in his own guilt, that he had never simply courted her as a woman. He crossed the room and took her hands. "You're right," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been a coward, hiding behind my guilt when I should have been fighting for you. Victoria Peaton can talk about business, but she could never understand your strength. She'll never have your grace or your courage." He framed her face with his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Let me choose you, Catherine. Not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Because when I imagine my future, you are in every single picture that matters." The kiss wasn't the tentative kiss of teenagers. It was a kiss of two adults who had been to hell and back, who knew how rare and precious a second chance was. When they finally broke apart, the questions and the doubts and the ghosts of the past had all been burned away. "What about Victoria?" she whispered. "What about her?" Jack shrugged. "There are a million business opportunities in this world, Catherine. There's only one you." 6 months later, they were married in the garden of the Elm Street house. The entire town was there. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a celebration of hope, a testament to a love that had refused to die. Emma was the maid of honor, and Samuel, bursting with pride, stood beside Jack as his best man. As Catherine walked through the garden toward the man who had waited a lifetime for her, she knew their story had finally reached its true beginning. That evening, as the party wound down, they stood on the porch watching their children play, their town celebrating their happiness. "Any regrets?" Jack asked, his arm around his wife. Catherine leaned against him, feeling a sense of peace that was so profound it was almost overwhelming. "Only one," she said. "I regret that it took us 23 years to get here." Jack pulled her closer. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully, "we needed those years. Maybe we needed to become the people we are now before we could build something that would last forever." The cowboy had seen his childhood love at her absolute lowest, and he had chosen compassion. He had chosen love. He had chosen action. What he did next didn't just leave the town speechless. It restored their faith in the idea that good things can happen to good people. And in the end, that was the only story that truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story of love and second chances, you're not going to want to miss the two incredible tales we have waiting for you right on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because you never know when the next unforgettable story will drop.